What I want to do now is to speak to the structure of the speech and explain to you what I think are important constituents of an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. Now, bearing in mind that linguistically and non-verbally, you don't want to do anything that distracts or that keeps away from the learning in the speaking environment. Just let that be the foundation for your thought. Now, with regard to introductions, what is the purpose of an introduction of a speech? It's simply to get constructive attention, and it's to direct the people's thoughts toward the subject at hand. So normally, an introduction will have some sort of attention-getting material, and this could be in the form of a quotation, statistics, a striking statement, anything like that that can capture your audience's interest in a constructive way. And then secondly, you want to direct that interest toward the body of the speech that you're going to be moving into in just a few moments. In other words, mindless joke telling, which is not related to the subject at all, is really not very good. An attention-getting device at the beginning of a speech that's irrelevant or that is too shocking is totally inappropriate. So just remember those things. In the introduction, you're getting their attention and you're directing their attention toward the specific subject that you're talking about. The body of the speech needs to be very clearly organized. And I would say within the body of the speech, and the body, of course, is constituted of the 2 or 3 main ideas that you want to develop in the speech. The body of the speech should be clearly organized and clearly spelled out for your listeners. The words that you use should be simple enough and repeated enough so that they understand what you're saying. Remember again, the critical element is understanding, and that is what you want to do in this speech in the speeches that you will be giving. So you will have 2 or 3 main points, and you should signpost those points for us very clearly. That is my first idea, my second idea, my third idea. Again, that's designed to emphasize those points so that the audience can learn them clearly. In addition to that, I think it's important within I would say the intellectual content of the speech to make sure that the ideas interrelate with each other and that they in turn relate back to what your central idea is. If your central idea is to explain the construction of the Colosseum, for example, then you want to make sure that everything that's going on in the body of the speech develops that central idea, how the Colosseum was constructed. Now, in order to determine how you would take that topic apart, how you would dissect it, let's just use the example of the Colosseum. You would want to think, well, if I want to explain the nature of the Colosseum, what subjects would I have to address in order to explain it properly? Well, I think you'd want to give some history to it. That would be one major point. Another one would be construction techniques and what it's constructed of. And I'd say the third is what is the Colosseum like today? What's being done to preserve it? Those 3 things, those 3 ideas, would give us an overall main idea, which is to describe, to introduce us to the nature of the Roman Colosseum. So that's how you subdivide your speech into main points or main ideas that in an outline form, for example, would be like your Roman numerals 1, 2, and 3. So make sure your language is clear, your signposts are clear, and that they all relate back to your major idea. One other thing I want to mention in terms of the content, the internal content verbally of the speech. Internal summaries and transitions are very important in a speech. You know, when you were assigned the writing of an essay in English, you were told that you wanted unity, coherence, and emphasis. You want the same thing in a speech. And you were also told that you should have appropriate transitions and summary statements. In an essay, you want the exact same thing in a speech. So what you've got here, if you can think of introduction, body, and conclusion, in terms of internal summaries and transitions, when you get to the end of your introduction, I always think it's very good to give us just a brief preview of the speech. Then you go into your first major point. You state the point, you develop it, you summarize it in one short sentence, and provide a transition into point 2. And you do the same thing with regard to point 2 into point 3. And then, of course, you've got the conclusion, which is a generic summary of the whole speech. So in terms of the words of the speech, just remember unity, coherence, emphasis, clarity. That's very, very important. And remember those guidelines, the signposts, the internal summaries, and transitions that I was talking about. Now, let me say a word about how you deliver the speech. This is probably the most difficult thing that everyone has to go through. What's the best delivery form? Now, I want you to understand I'm speaking from an optimal point of view. And I know that there are some people for whom delivering speeches is much easier than others. So I think we can have that understanding. And understand also that I'm talking about the optimal form of delivery. The optimal form of delivery, I think, is what you would call conversational style. It's the sort of style that I use when I'm talking to you. And it's also the type of style that uses what you would call a keyword outline. Now, I know in one of your presentations you may read a manuscript. It just depends on what your teacher decides to do. But let's assume that you're not. What sort of notes should you have to speak from? Well, the notes I have to speak from right here are outlines. Very simple keyword outlines. That's the way all my lectures are, and that's the way I think speeches are best. Because you don't want the speech to be memorized. You want it to sound conversational. You don't want it to sound read. That's very boring. So what you want to aim for is a very conversational, what is called an extemporaneous style. There are 3 general styles for the delivery of speeches. You can have a style that is memorized, you can have extemporaneous, or you can have impromptu. Impromptu has no preparation. I hope none of your speeches are impromptu. So that leaves you with the memorized or the extemporaneous. And of the 2, I think for most people the extemporaneous is easiest to deliver. And in this delivery style, you don't have all of your words written down. You've rehearsed it 4 or 5 times, so you generally know what you're saying. And as a result, you get sort of a spontaneity. You change the wording from time to time as you give the speech. And that promotes a sense of conversationality in your speaking, which I think is very good. People like that more than something that's pre-prepared and read and boring and very fake sounding. People want sincerity in delivery. So remember the conversational style. The pace of speaking is important. I think it's important for you to speak slowly enough so people can comprehend you, but not so slowly as to make yourself boring. That's up to you, but most people, when they speak, will have a tendency to speak too quickly, especially novice speakers, and it's because they're nervous. So try to time your speech, time it well, be within the time frame that your teacher gives you, but at the same time, you might write yourself notes on your notes that say slow down or something like that if you have a tendency to go too fast. An absolutely critical, always critical element of effective speaking is eye contact. Almost total eye contact, occasional reference to a note is perfectly fine. But generally, eye contact, most of the time, is the most effective way of delivery. The aversion of eye contact or the looking over or around your audience rather than at them is really a very poor delivery. So you should strive for constant, if possible, eye contact. I think it's also important for you to be fluent in your delivery. Now, you can have too much fluency. The guy who's a used car salesman who talks like this, who's just so fluent you just can't even believe it, that's coming across as being very false. You don't want that. And I think if you use an extemporaneous style and you rehearse enough, you will have adequate fluency. A few uhs or ums really don't matter. So don't let that bother you. But generally, fluency, the speech is moving on, you're giving your summaries, you're making your transitions, you're going from point to point, you have a sense of confidence in what you're doing. That fluency is important. Another critical element in delivery is volume. People have to be able to hear you. If they cannot hear you, your speaking is futile. So it's important for you to project. Most people don't have a problem with that. Now, the two critical elements that I want to talk about beyond this are two aspects of delivery with which some people have problems. One has to do with vocal variety and energy. And everybody knows that the person who speaks in a monotone, who talks like this, who doesn't have eye contact, everybody knows that's poor speaking. It's easier for some people to project personality and energy and confidence in what they do, and I know that. But I would not be telling you the truth if I didn't tell you that speaking that is the most effective has appropriate energy levels. And I said appropriate because I know sometimes some people are too energetic, and they're just a little high, and you really don't care to hear that. It also depends on the time of day. But generally, higher energy levels, conversational delivery, eye contact, and increased vocal variety are associated with very, very good speaking. And I'll mention now what people get really anxious about, and this is bodily movement, gesturing. Well, generally, body-wise, you don't need to do anything that's going to distract from your speech. So you don't want to be fooling with your hair or your glasses, clicking a pen, chewing gum. All of that I think you should know. You just don't want any bodily movement that is distracting. You don't have to move a lot. Some people move more or less. I think it's important probably for you to stand in place and not to pace around. I think it's also important for you to have appropriate facial expression, not to look somber or sullen or, like this is the worst thing that ever happened to me look. You don't want that. You want to look pleasant, but I think you don't want to distract from your speech. So those are the two main areas included in the body of the speech: the discussion of the cognitive content and the discussion of the delivery. And I want to say now a word about conclusions. It's been my experience in the many years I've taught speech that the conclusion is probably the most neglected part of the speech. And it's because a lot of people think that they can just simply end. Well, that's about it. That's probably the poorest thing for you to do. If you'll think in terms of the needs, the psychological forms that I've talked about before, one of the essential things in a speech is closure. You want to feel like that you have begun something and that you have ended it. And ending it appropriately with a conclusion that's well thought out and well worded is absolutely essential. Now, what you do not do in a conclusion is you don't go back over every point and summarize all the detail of the speech. You merely conclude your main summary position, your central idea. I also think it's really good in the conclusion if you can refer back to the introduction or use a quote or something besides just ending the speech. So a quote, statistics, a call to action if it's a persuasive speech, anything like that, a striking statistic, referring back to something you alluded to in the introduction. Those are good ways to conclude a speech. So what you've got in a speech is you've got a good learning instrument. It's like a little mini lecture that's good. You've got an introduction that gets the people ready to hear what you're going to hear. You say it, and then you say it again. Tell me what you're going to tell me, and tell me what you told me. And that, in a nutshell, is the way to have an effective speech.